The morning Cora Wells walked up to the fence line of the west field, Henry Malone nearly dropped his coffee straight into the dirt. He had been standing on the porch of the main house, watching the sun pull itself up over the ridge the way it always did in late April, slow and orange and indifferent to the grief of men, when he saw her moving through the high grass beyond the broken gate. She was not wandering. She was not admiring the view. She was walking with purpose, her dark braids swinging against her back, a long-handled soil probe in her right hand, and she was driving it into the earth every few feet and pulling it back up and studying what came with it. As if the field belonged to her, as if she had every right. Henry set his tin cup down on the railing so hard it rattled against the wood. The west field. 3 years. 3 years of letting that ground sit fallow and hard-packed and silent, and nobody on this ranch had so much as leaned over the fence post to look at it without catching a look from Henry that made them find somewhere else to be. Not his foreman, Cal Briggs, who had been with him 12 years. Not old Dora, who cooked and cleaned, and sometimes said things Henry did not ask her to say. Not any of the 3 hands who worked the cattle and knew exactly where the invisible lines were on the Malone property, drawn not with wire but with something much harder to cross. And now here was this woman, Cora Wells, who had been on his land for exactly 9 days, driving a soil probe into the earth of the west field like she had a perfect right to it, and daring the world to tell her otherwise. Henry was off the porch and moving before he had finished the thought. He crossed the yard in long strides, the dry grass crunching under his boots, and when he reached the gate he did not bother to ease it open, but pushed through it hard enough that the rusted hinges screamed. Cora did not flinch. She pulled the probe from the earth again, tipped the core of soil into her palm, rubbed it between her fingers and brought it close to her face to smell it. She looked up at him with those clear gray eyes that always seemed to be measuring something he could not quite identify, and she said, "The clay subsoil is about 14 inches down, deeper than I expected. That's actually good news." Henry stopped 6 feet from her. His jaw was tight. His hands were loose at his sides because he was a man who had learned a long time ago that the worst things you could do, you did when your hands were closed. He looked at her and he said, in a voice that left no room for misunderstanding, "Get out of this field, Miss Wells." Cora looked at him for a moment the way a person looks at a complicated equation they are not yet ready to put down. Then she looked back at the soil in her palm. "The top 6 inches have good organic matter content," she said. "Somebody worked this ground well before it was left. I can see the old furrow lines under the grass if you look at the angle of the growth. Whoever broke this field knew what they were doing." "Get out of this field," Henry said again, and his voice was lower this time, which was not softer. Cora Wells finally looked at him fully. She closed her fingers around the soil sample and she said, "Mr. Malone, I'm not trying to disturb anything that is not mine to disturb, but you hired me as your agricultural consultant, and this field is on your property, and it is the best piece of ground you own. If you want to recover from 3 years of loss on this ranch, this is where you start." She paused. "I just need to know what happened here before I can tell you what to plant." The silence that fell between them was the kind that has weight to it. Henry looked at the field. He had not looked at it, not really looked at it in 3 years. He had looked past it and around it and over it. He had trained himself not to see it the way you train yourself not to see a scar that is in your line of sight in the mirror every morning. He forced himself to look at it now, at the tangled grass and the old fence posts, and the slight rise of the ground toward the cottonwood grove at the western edge where the creek bent, and the looking was like pressing on a bruise that had never healed properly. "A woman died in this field," he said. Cora did not move. She did not make a sound of sympathy or shift her weight or do any of the things people usually did when you said something like that to them. The things that made you feel like the grief was something they needed to manage away from themselves. She simply looked at him and waited. "My wife," Henry said. "Her name was Ruth." He turned and walked back toward the house. He did not invite Cora to follow him, but he also did not tell her to leave. And that, as she would tell him much later, was the first door he had ever opened for her. Cora Wells had come to Harlan County, Texas, in the spring of 1887 under circumstances that were, in her own estimation, entirely logical, and in the estimation of nearly everyone else in the county, entirely scandalous. She was 27 years old, unmarried, the daughter of a soil scientist who had spent her childhood following her father across the agricultural experiment stations of the eastern states, and had learned at his knee everything that could be learned about land and seed, and the secret language that soil spoke to those patient enough to listen. When her father died in the winter of 1885, he left her his field journals, his equipment, his library of 34 books on agronomy and botany and land improvement, and the ability to read a piece of ground the way most people could not read a printed page. She had also inherited the deep inconvenience of being a woman in a profession that men did not believe women could practice. She had spent 2 years in Missouri working quietly, almost invisibly, advising farmers through their county extension office in the name of her late father, writing up reports under his name, and watching her recommendations transform fields that had been declining for decades. She had made more money than most single women in her situation, but she had also grown quietly furious at the arrangement, at the necessity of hiding herself behind a dead man's name to have her work taken seriously. She had come to Texas because a lawyer named Gerard Holloway in Harlan County had advertised in an agricultural bulletin for a land consultant to assess the holdings of several ranches in the region and make recommendations for crop diversification. The pay was exceptional. The letter she sent in reply was signed with her own name and contained enough technical detail about land reclamation techniques that Mr. Holloway had apparently not paused long enough to consider that C. E. Wells might be a woman. By the time he found out, she was standing in his office with her father's leather satchel and a letter of professional introduction from the Missouri Extension Office that he had no easy way to dismiss. He had spluttered and objected, and implied that no rancher in the county would submit to the assessment of a female scientist, and Cora had sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and asked him which property he wanted her to begin with. The arrangement they reached was a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely. She would conduct her work. He would present her to clients as the representative of the Wells agricultural consulting practice, allowing each rancher to interpret her gender and position as they saw fit. If they objected after meeting her, she would move to the next property. She had been dismissed from 2 of the 4 properties before she arrived at the Malone Ranch. The first rancher, a red-faced man named Dunbar, had shaken his head before she finished her opening sentence and told Holloway that he had not agreed to hire a schoolgirl. The second had been more polite about it and only marginally less insulting, saying that he had too much respect for his late mother to ask a woman to walk fields in the heat of summer. Cora had noted both rejections in her journal and kept her expression entirely neutral. Henry Malone had not rejected her. He had looked at her for a long moment when she arrived with Holloway, and then he had looked at Holloway, and then he had said, "You can put her in the east room. Dora will show her where things are." And he had walked back into his barn. Cora had considered that a provisional acceptance and conducted herself accordingly. For 9 days she had worked the Malone Ranch systematically, beginning at the eastern boundary and moving west, testing soils and observing drainage patterns and recording the locations of the water sources and assessing the pasture quality and the condition of the fences. She had been professional and quiet and thorough, and Henry Malone had largely left her alone, which was the closest thing to respect she had received in Harlan County so far. She had saved the west field for last. Not because it was the least important. Because everything she had observed in 9 days told her it was the most important piece of ground on the property, and she had wanted to understand the rest of the ranch first before she approached it. She had also noticed, with the precise observational attention that made her exceptional at her work, that nobody on the ranch went near it. that the hands gave it a wide arc when they moved the cattle to the south pasture, that Henry Malone's eyes moved over it every morning from the porch and then looked away. She had known there was a story in that field before she drove the first probe into the ground. She had not expected it to be that kind of story. Cora stood in the west field for a long time after Henry walked away, turning the soil sample in her fingers and looking at the ground under her feet. A woman had died here, his wife. The ground did not know about grief. The ground only knew about what it had been given and what it had not, and this ground, this beautiful, deep-soiled, well-positioned piece of earth, had been given 3 years of nothing. It had been punished for something that was not its fault. She understood that in a way she did not try to explain to herself, because some things you understood in your body before your mind had the language for them. She walked slowly back to the gate and let herself out and went to find her satchel. That evening at supper, which Dora served in the kitchen with the same efficiency and selective silence she brought to all household operations, Henry sat at the head of the table and Cora sat at the far end, and Cal Briggs sat in the middle with his hat off and his weathered face politely directed at his plate. The two younger hands, a quiet young man named Davis and his equally quiet cousin Eli, ate at the smaller table near the door. Nobody spoke much. Henry Malone did not appear to be a man who used mealtimes as an occasion for conversation. Cora ate her cornbread and her beans and waited until the meal was almost finished before she said, without preamble, "I would like your permission to prepare the west field for planting." The kitchen went very still. Cal Briggs stopped chewing. Davis and Eli both looked up from their table. Dora, who had been at the stove with her back to the room, did not turn around, but her shoulders went rigid. Henry did not move. He looked at Cora from the far end of the table with an expression that she had already catalogued in 9 days of observing him, the expression he wore when something had penetrated deeper than he had expected it to, an expression of contained surprise that looked, from the outside, very much like anger. "No," he said. Cora nodded once, as if this were information she had anticipated and was now incorporating into her plans. "The field represents the best agricultural potential on your property by a significant margin," she said. "The soil depth, the drainage, the sun exposure, the proximity to the creek bend. If you want to increase the earning capacity of this ranch, which based on your financial situation you need to do in the next 2 growing seasons, that field is not optional." She paused. "I understand it carries weight for you. I'm not asking you to work it yourself. I'm asking you to let me do it." Henry looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that was trying to find the angle from which she became manageable. She met it without blinking. "It is not about whether I work it," he said. "Then what is it about?" The question sat in the air between them like something with a pulse. Henry pushed his chair back and walked out of the kitchen. The back door swung shut behind him, and outside they could hear his boots on the porch steps and then nothing. Cal Briggs let out a slow breath. He looked at Cora with an expression that was not quite warning and not quite sympathy, but somewhere in between. "Miss Wells," he said quietly, "that field is where Mrs. Malone died, 3 years ago in June. Fever took her fast. Mr. Malone found her in the field. She had gone out to plant in the morning and he found her there when she did not come in for supper." Cora was quiet for a moment. "I see," she said. "He has not gone into that field since," Cal said. "None of us have. It seemed like the right thing." "Yes," Cora said. "I imagine it did." She finished her supper and thanked Dora and went upstairs to her room, and she sat at the small desk by the window and looked out over the ranch in the dark, at the silver-edged shape of the west field under the new moon, and she thought about what it meant to love a piece of earth so much that, when it became the place where you lost someone you loved, you could not decide whether you hated it or needed it more. She thought about her own father, about the fields he had loved, about the way grief could hollow a person out and leave them walking around looking like themselves, while inside they were just an echo of the shape they used to be. She did not write in her journal that night. She sat at the window for a long time and then she went to bed, and in the morning she did not go near the west field. She gave it 3 days. On the 4th day, she caught Henry at the water trough near the barn before he could disappear into his morning work, and she said, "Mr. Malone, I want to talk to you about Ruth." He turned very slowly and looked at her. "You don't know anything about Ruth," he said. "No," Cora agreed. "But I want to if you'll let me." She watched his face. "Not for my report, not for the field, just because you loved her and she is clearly worth knowing about." Something moved behind Henry Malone's eyes, something swift and unguarded that he covered quickly. He looked away from her, toward the mountains in the west, blue-gray and permanent in the morning light. "She liked to plant things," he said, after a silence that Cora did not interrupt. "Everything she could get her hands on. She ordered seeds from a catalog from back east, and she kept them in labeled tins on a shelf in the kitchen, and every spring she started them inside before it was warm enough to plant outside, little paper pots in every windowsill." He stopped. The west field was going to be hers. She had planned what she wanted to grow there for 2 seasons before I had the soil broken. Vegetables mostly, some flowers. She said the ranch needed color. His voice was carefully controlled. "She went out to plant the first seeds the June after I broke the field, and she was dead before the week was out. I found her lying between the furrow rows as if she had just sat down to rest." Cora looked at the ground. "I'm sorry," she said. Henry looked back at her. "I don't want your sympathy, Miss Wells." "I know," Cora said. "I'm not offering it. I am telling you I am sorry because you lost someone who loved beautiful things, and that is worth saying." She met his eyes. "What seeds did she order?" Henry stared at her. Of all the questions she could have asked, this one clearly caught him entirely off guard. "What?" "The tins on the kitchen shelf." "What seeds did she have?" He blinked. He looked away again. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, as if the question had opened something he had not expected to open. "Tomatoes, sweet corn. She wanted to grow watermelons, which I told her would not take in this soil, and she told me I was wrong. Sunflowers. She was very particular about the sunflowers. She had found some variety that grew to 8 feet tall." He paused. "Runner beans, squash. A kind of sweet pepper that she said her grandmother had grown in Virginia." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She knew what she was doing. Runner beans and squash are ideal companions for the soil profile in that field. The beans fix nitrogen, the squash shades out the competing vegetation. And she was right about the watermelons. With the clay subsoil at 14 inches, the water retention in summer would be sufficient if you plant in the low part of the field near the creek bend." Henry looked at her. "You are telling me she was right?" "Agriculturally, yes. She was absolutely right." Something happened to Henry Malone's face in that moment that Cora would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not tears. He was not that kind of man. And even if he had been, he would not have let them come in front of a woman he had known for less than 2 weeks. But it was something close to release, the way a man looked when he had been carrying something at a particular angle for so long that every muscle had shaped itself around the weight of it, and then someone suggested he could carry it differently, and the suggestion was so unexpected that for one unguarded second his whole body did not know what to do. He looked at Cora for a long time. Then he said, "I have the tins." Cora went very still. "Still." "In the kitchen, on the shelf. Nobody moved them." He glanced away. "I don't know why I never moved them." "Because you knew she was right," Cora said gently, "even when it hurt." The morning light was coming gold across the yard, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses was shifting in its stall, and the world was going about its ordinary business with the complete indifference to human suffering that it always had. And in the middle of all of that, Henry Malone, who had not looked directly at the west field in 3 years, turned and looked at it. He stood that way for a long time. Then he said, quietly, steadily, the way a man says something that he has been wrestling with since before the sun came up, "You can plant it." Cora felt the words settle into her chest like something solid. She did not say anything immediately because she recognized that this was not a small thing he had just done, that the 3 words he had said had cost him something real, and the right response to that was not efficiency or enthusiasm but simply presence. "Thank you," she said at last. "Ruth's seeds are too old to germinate. Henry said. His voice returned to its practical register. 3 years in tins. You will need to source new ones. I know a seed supplier in San Antonio, Cora said. I can write to him today and have what we need within 2 weeks. Henry nodded once sharply and walked into the barn. Cora stood in the yard for a moment longer, looking at the west field. Then she went inside to write her letter. What followed were 2 weeks that Cora would later identify as the period during which everything changed, though she would not have been able to name the exact day the change began or the precise mechanism by which it happened. It was not a single event, but an accumulation of small ones. The way a field changes not all at once but gradually through the patient work of seasons. She wrote to her seed supplier in San Antonio and to 2 others she knew from her father's network, ordering the varieties that Henry had described as Ruth selections, because she had decided that this was not simply going to be a commercially productive planting, but also a memorial one, and the 2 purposes were not in conflict. She ordered additional varieties suited to the specific conditions she had documented, drought-resistant corn, and a particularly productive variety of sweet potato that her father had experimented with in Arkansas and found to be exceptional in clay-heavy soils. While she waited for the seeds, she began preparing the field. The first morning she went in with a spade, and the second morning Henry came to stand at the fence and watch her, and she did not acknowledge him because she had learned that Henry Malone did not like to be made self-conscious. On the third morning, Cal Briggs appeared at the gate and asked if she could use an extra hand, and Cora said yes without looking up from the furrow she was cutting. And Cal came in and picked up a spade, and they worked together in companionable silence for 3 hours. On the fourth morning, Henry came through the gate. He walked to the far end of the field and picked up a spade that Cora had left leaning against the fence post, and he drove it into the ground, and he did not say anything, and Cora did not say anything either, and they worked side by side from mid-morning until the light got too low to see the furrows clearly. And when they stopped, Cora looked at the field and then at Henry, and she said, she would have loved to see this. Henry did not answer, but after a moment he nodded once, and it was the most complete thing she had ever seen him do. The seeds arrived on a Tuesday, packed in paper and labeled in the supplier's careful hand, and Cora spent the evening sorting them at the kitchen table, checking germination rates and calculating planting densities, and organizing the planting schedule by variety and by position in the field. Henry came in for his late coffee and saw her at the table with the seeds spread out around her and her journal open and her pencil moving, and he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, which was new. "Show me," he said. Cora looked up. His expression was not soft, exactly. Henry Malone's expressions were rarely soft. But there was an openness in it, an intent attentiveness that she had not seen directed at her before. She turned her journal so he could see the field diagram she had drawn, with the varieties mapped out in their planned positions, and she began to explain. She told him about the companion planting logic, the nitrogen cycle, the water retention patterns she had identified, the way she had positioned the tall crops to provide shade for the heat-sensitive varieties in the afternoon. She told him about the yield projections she had calculated, the market values in the nearest town, how the revenue from even a partial first-season harvest could offset a significant portion of the operational costs she had identified as pressing in her broader ranch assessment. Henry listened without interrupting, which she had already identified as one of the things that made him unusual among the ranchers she had worked for. He did not interject with opinions or corrections. He simply listened, and she could see him taking it in, turning it over, integrating it. His eyes moved between the diagram and her face, and she found that she did not mind when they were on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The sunflowers, you haven't put them on the plan." Cora paused. She looked at her diagram. He was right. She had included all the food crops, all the economically productive varieties, and she had left out the sunflowers. "I wasn't sure they served the agricultural objectives," she said. Henry looked at her steadily. Ruth wanted sunflowers, he said. Put them on the plan. Cora picked up her pencil. Where? The eastern edge, Henry said. She said the morning light would hit them first there. She said she wanted them to be the first thing the sun found in the morning. Cora wrote it on the diagram, the eastern edge, sunflowers 8-foot variety. Her hand was very steady. She did not look up at Henry because she could feel the weight of what he had just shared, and she wanted to give him the space to have shared it without it becoming a moment that made him regret the openness. I'll add them to the next order, she said. I have the seed, Henry said. He stood up. I found them this morning in the tins. The sunflower seed was packed in a separate tin, more carefully than the others. He went to the shelf above the window, the shelf where the labeled tins still stood in their row, 3 years of standing exactly where Ruth had left them, and he picked up one tin near the end. He brought it back to the table and set it in front of Cora. She lifted the lid carefully. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been a flour sack, were sunflower seeds, large and striped, clearly from a heritage variety, saved by hand. Ruth had not bought these from a catalog. She had saved them herself. Will they germinate? Henry asked, and for the first time in the weeks since Cora had arrived on this ranch, she heard something nakedly vulnerable in his voice, the voice of a man asking whether a thing he needed to be alive was still alive. Cora lifted one of the seeds and turned it between her fingers. She looked at the oil residue on the seed coat, at the integrity of the hull, at the color and density of it. She brought it to her nose. She pressed her thumbnail gently against the coat. Yes, she said. She looked up at him. She packed them in cloth instead of leaving them loose in the tin. It preserved the oil content. They will germinate. She paused. She knew exactly what she was doing. Henry looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and put the lid back on the tin with great care, as if what was inside were something infinitely more fragile than seeds, and he said, "Plant them. All of them." Cora nodded. "Every single one." Planting began the first week of May, which Cora's calculations identified as the optimal window for the Texas Hill Country conditions on the Malone property. She set a schedule and briefed Cal and the hands on their rolls, and Henry worked alongside all of them, not directing but working, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands in the soil for the first time in 3 years, and Cora watched him sometimes when he was not looking, and saw the way the tension that he always carried in his shoulders and jaw changed when he was working the ground, not disappeared, but transformed into something more purposeful and less like pain. She was direct on this point only to herself. She was falling in love with Henry Malone. She had not intended to. She had arrived at this ranch with the specific professional intention of doing her work well and ethically, and moving on to the next engagement. And she had arrived with a very clear understanding of the professional complications of allowing personal feelings to develop with a client. And she had arrived with 3.5 years of committed bachelorhood behind her, and a settled conviction that love was a luxury that her particular life circumstances did not easily accommodate. And yet here she was, in the west field of the Malone Ranch in the spring of 1887, watching Henry Malone press seed into the earth with hands that were simultaneously the most practical hands she had ever seen, and the hands of a man working through grief towards something she could not yet name, and her chest was full of something she had absolutely no professional protocol for. She went back to her furrow and concentrated. The problem with falling in love with Henry Malone, aside from all the obvious professional complications, was that Henry Malone had been in love with a woman named Ruth, and Ruth had been extraordinary, and the only information Cora had about her was fragments, the seeds she had saved, and the varieties she had chosen, and the careful intelligence of her planting plan. But even from fragments you could sometimes reconstruct the whole. And the whole that Cora reconstructed from the evidence Ruth had left in the west field was a woman of real grace and intelligence and joy. The kind of woman who ordered 8-foot sunflowers because she wanted the ranch to have color. The kind of woman who saved her best seeds wrapped in cloth because she understood that living things deserved to be preserved with care. Cora understood why Henry had not recovered. What she did not know, what she spent a great deal of the planting week turning over in the quiet of her own mind, was whether a man who had loved someone like that could ever redirect that love towards someone as different as she was. Ruth had been a woman who planted flowers. Cora was a woman who wrote soil composition reports and argued with ranchers about drainage gradients. Ruth had apparently filled windowsills with seedlings and brought color to things. Cora's general approach to aesthetics was to be aware of it and move efficiently past it. She was not Ruth. She would never be Ruth. And she was not certain whether Henry Malone had room in him for anything that was not Ruth. She planted sunflowers along the eastern edge on a Thursday morning, pressing each seed from the old cloth-wrapped tin into the earth at the depth, and spacing her calculations indicated. And when she was halfway down the row, she heard the gate open and looked up to see Henry crossing toward her. He was not carrying a tool. He was just walking to where she was. He stopped a few feet away and watched her work for a moment. "You're pressing them deeper than I expected," he said. "The soil is loose here from the preparation work," Cora said. "I want them anchored before the summer storms. If they go in too shallow, the first real wind will take them over before they have a root system strong enough to hold." Henry crouched down beside her. He picked up a seed from the pile she had set on the cloth beside her and turned it in his fingers, not studying it the way she would have, but in a different way, in the way you hold something that was touched by someone you loved. "Ruth told me sunflowers turn their faces to follow the sun," he said. "She said she read it in a book somewhere. She thought it was the finest thing a living thing could do, to turn toward the light even when the light moves." Cora was very still. She was looking at the furrow she was working, but she was not seeing the furrow. "Heliotropism," she said. "It's what the scientists call it." She paused. She was right. Young sunflowers do it most actively. The east-facing planting means they will catch the morning sun at the exact moment it is strongest for the tracking response. Henry was quiet. Then he said, "You say she was right about her quite a lot." Cora set another seed in the earth. "That is because she was," she said, repeatedly and demonstrably. She felt Henry looking at her, the particular quality of attention that was different from the way he looked at most things, the way he looked when he was really seeing something. She kept her hands moving on the seeds. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. "That she was right." Cora sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "Because you're still grieving her," she said. "And the hardest part of grief is the feeling that maybe the person you lost was not quite known while they were here, that maybe you did not fully see them. The West Field was Ruth's plan, and it was a genuinely excellent plan, and I think it would be good for you to know that." Henry looked at her for a long time. His expression was the complex one again, the one that was not anger but wore anger's clothes. "You are a very unusual woman, Cora Wells," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. Cora felt the warmth of it very precisely, which was inconvenient. "So I have been told," she said. Henry almost smiled. It was the smallest possible precursor of a smile, barely a shift in the lines around his mouth, but Cora catalogued it. He reached past her and pressed a seed into the earth himself, at the right depth, at the right spacing, continuing her row, and neither of them said anything else, but they finished the sunflower row together in the afternoon light. And when they were done, Cora looked at the length of it and thought that it was the most honest half-hour she had spent in a very long time. The week after the planting was complete, Cora finished her formal agricultural assessment of the Malone ranch. She sat at the desk in the East Room and wrote it out in full. The soil analyses and the drainage maps and the yield projections and the recommended crop rotation schedule for the next 5 years. And she appended to it a financial analysis that showed, in straightforward numbers, the path by which the ranch could move from its current position of mounting debt to solvency within 3 growing seasons if her recommendations were followed, with the West Field's productivity playing a central role in that recovery. She left it on the kitchen table the next morning before breakfast. She found Henry reading it when she came down. He was at the table with his coffee and the report, and he was reading slowly, the way a man reads something he is taking seriously. He did not look up when she came in. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him and waited. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "This is good work," he said. And Henry Malone was not a man who said things like that lightly, who paid compliments as social currency, and so the words arrived with full weight. "Thank you," Cora said. "I am surprised," he said. Then, because he was a man who lived inside honesty even when it was uncomfortable, he added, "I should tell you that when Holloway brought you here, I did not expect to be saying that." Cora raised her eyebrows very slightly. "Because I am a woman." "Yes," Henry said without apology. "I was wrong about that." It was, in its bluntness, one of the most graceful things anyone had said to her in a professional context in years. She felt the absurd urge to laugh and controlled it with some effort. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. "There are places in this report I want to ask you about," Henry said, tapping a page. "This section on the cattle pasture rotation. I have a concern about the fencing costs." "Show me," Cora said, and leaned forward, and they spent the next hour at the kitchen table working through the report together. Henry asking sharp, practical questions and Cora answering them, and sometimes being pushed to justify her recommendations more thoroughly than she had expected. Because Henry Malone, whatever his blind spots, was not a man of small intelligence, and working with him on the practical logic of the ranch plan was, she found, one of the most genuinely engaging hours she had spent in a long time. When they reached the section on the west field, Henry stopped and read it twice. "You have projected a first-year revenue from this field that would cover the outstanding debt on the equipment loan," he said. "Yes," Cora said. "That is the loan I have been carrying since Ruth got sick," he said. "The medical expenses and the harvest I missed that year." His voice was steady, but she could hear the history in it, the weight of 3 years of that particular number. "I know," she said. "I found the loan paperwork in the ranch records you gave me access to." It seemed important to address it specifically. Henry looked at her. There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, something she almost did not recognize because she had been so careful not to hope for it, something that was beginning to look, very tentatively and very carefully, like the earliest edge of trust. "The field is coming up," he said. "I checked this morning. The corn is already breaking the surface." Cora felt a smile come to her face before she could decide whether to allow it. "The bean seedlings will be next," she said. 3 to 5 days. "And the sunflowers? A week, maybe 10 days," she paused. "They will be worth the wait." Henry looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than the situation professionally required, and then he looked at the report again and said, "I need to wire the bank in Austin. If your projections are correct, I can renegotiate the terms." "Your projections," Cora said. "I drew up the plan. You said yes to planting the field. Without that, there are no projections." Henry was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I said yes because you asked." The kitchen was very still. The morning light was coming in over the eastern window, and it was touching the shelf of seed tins and the floor between the table and the door. And Cora was looking at Henry Malone, and Henry Malone was looking at the report, and the words were sitting between them in the morning quiet with more significance than either of them was quite ready to hold directly. "Well," Cora said at last, in a voice that she kept practical with conscious effort, "I am glad you did." There was a sound at the back door, Cal Briggs arriving for the morning consultation, and the moment expanded back into the ordinary shape of the day, and nothing was said that was not practical and professional for the rest of the morning. But something had shifted. Cora felt it the same way you feel a change in the barometric pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the knowledge that the weather is turning and nothing after this will be quite the same as it was before. The complication arrived, as complications in Harlan County tended to, in the form of a man named Fletcher Oakes. Fletcher Oakes was 41 years old and owned the largest property in the county and had, for reasons that Cora learned from Dora over the course of a surprisingly informative evening of pie making, been interested in the Malone Ranch for approximately 3 years. specifically since it became clear that Henry was struggling financially in the wake of Ruth's death. He was a man who understood the mathematics of other people's hardship with impressive precision. He appeared at the Malone Ranch on a Friday afternoon in the third week of May, riding up in a good suit on a good horse, and he came into the yard with the particular confidence of a man who believed that everything he saw was already, in some important sense, his. Cora was at the well near the barn when he rode in, and he looked at her the way men like him looked at women who were doing things they considered surprising, with an expression of amused assessment that she had long since learned to ignore. Henry came out of the house, and Fletcher climbed down and shook his hand and said, "Heard you finally got that west field going, Henry. Good to see it." Henry said something polite that Cora did not catch, and then Fletcher looked toward her and said, "Heard you had a female agronomist working the land. Didn't believe it until just now." Henry looked at Cora and then at Fletcher and said, with complete evenness, "Miss Wells is a professional consultant from Missouri. She has produced the most comprehensive land assessment this property has had." Fletcher smiled, the smile of a man who was more dangerous when he was smiling than when he was frowning. "Impressive," he said. "Miss Wells," he looked at her directly. "Holloway showed me your general methodology when you were being considered for the survey contract. I have to say, I thought it was interesting work, for what it was." Cora recognized the construction, for what it was, as one of the most useful belittling phrases in the English language. "Thank you," she said pleasantly, because she had learned a very long time ago that the most effective response to a man attempting to diminish her was to absorb his small attacks without visible effect and wait for the moment when her actual competence made the diminishment look ridiculous. "Fletcher," Henry said, "what brings you out?" Fletcher turned back to Henry with a man-to-man shift of attention that was itself a small insult. "I wanted to talk to you about the south boundary," he said. "The fence line. I think there may be a survey question we need to resolve." Cora, who had been doing land surveys for 3 years and had read the Malone boundary documentation as part of her initial assessment, felt a very specific alertness come into her attention. She said nothing. Henry invited Fletcher into the house. Cora went back to the well, but she was thinking. That evening after Fletcher had left, she came to Henry in the barn, where he was working on a harness. She said without preamble, "What did Fletcher tell you about the south boundary survey?" Henry's hands paused on the harness. "He says there was a resurvey done of the Oaks property last year that suggests the boundary line between our properties is 20 yards west of where the current fencing is." Cora took a breath. "That would take approximately 40 acres of the south pasture." "Yes," Henry said. "Did he bring documentation?" "He said he would send it." Cora leaned against the barn post. "I surveyed that boundary as part of my assessment," she said. "I have the coordinates in my notes from the original land grant documentation. I would like to compare them against whatever Fletcher sends." Henry looked at her. "You can read a land survey." It was not quite a question, but she answered it as one. "My father included land survey methodology in my training because soil assessment and boundary verification often overlap in agricultural consulting. I have read approximately 60 land surveys in my professional career." She paused. "I would not offer if I were not capable." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Why would Fletcher make a false survey claim?" Cora looked at him steadily. "Because he has wanted this property since you were in financial difficulty. Because if he can take 40 acres of your best pasture, he reduces your cattle capacity and accelerates your financial position. Because the west field coming into production represents a threat to that plan." She paused. "This is not an accusation. It is a logical structure. Let me see the documentation before we draw conclusions." Henry looked at her for a long time. In the warm light of the barn, with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls and the smell of leather and hay in the air, he looked at her with the particular quality of attention that she was coming to understand was his version of trust, the way a man who did not give trust easily looked when he was giving it. "All right," he said. "Fletcher's documentation arrived by courier on Monday." Cora took it to the desk in the East Room and spread it out and spent 3 hours going through it alongside her own survey notes and the original land grant documentation from the ranch records and a surveyor's reference she had in her father's field kit. When she was done, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Then she went to find Henry. He was in the west field, which she noted with a quiet internal recognition, checking the progress of the early crops. She came through the gate and walked to where he was crouching beside a row of bean seedlings that were beginning their third leaf. She said, "The survey Fletcher submitted has been manufactured." Henry stood up. "You are certain?" "Yes." She held up the documents. The legal description on his survey uses a reference monument that was not established until 1884, but the land grant document for the Oaks property was filed in 1879. A legitimate resurvey of a 1879 grant would have to reference the original monuments from that filing. It cannot reference a 1884 monument for a 1879 boundary. The timeline is impossible. Someone produced this survey after the fact. Henry looked at her for a long moment, and this was the moment, the specific moment that she had not anticipated, and that Henry Malone would remember for the rest of his life. The moment when he looked at this woman who had arrived on his property 9 days after the seeds were delivered, and who had driven probes into the sacred ground of his grief, and who had told him his dead wife's plans were right and good and beautiful, and who was now standing in front of him in his west field with a surveyor's document in one hand and 3 years of professional training translated into absolute precision in her eyes, and he understood something. He understood that she was the most capable person who had walked onto this ranch in as long as he could remember, and the feeling that came with that understanding was not the mild professional appreciation he would have extended to a competent man in the same role. It was something else entirely. It was the specific and overwhelming feeling of being in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone who was simultaneously more formidable than he had expected and more, somehow, than the situation required, and the combination of those things was hitting him somewhere deep in the chest where practical considerations lived, next to the grief and the relief and the 3 years of solitude. "You are absolutely sure," he said again. "Henry," she said, using his name for the first time without deciding to, "I have been reading land documents for 8 years. The monument reference date is conclusive. There is no legitimate interpretation of this that does not involve fraud." He looked at her. The west field was growing around them, the bean seedlings green and certain, the corn a few inches tall in its rows, Ruth's seeds already doing what Ruth had always believed they would do. "What do I do?" he said. "You go to the county recorder in the morning," Cora said. "You bring this document and you bring my comparison notes and the original land grant document, and you ask the recorder to examine the monument reference. You also speak to a lawyer." She paused. "I can come with you if you want someone who can explain the technical elements." "Come with me," he said. She nodded. "I will have everything organized tonight." He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, with a directness that she had come to understand was his form of vulnerability, "What do I owe you for all of this? The field, the report, the survey. This is considerably more than was contracted." Cora looked at him. She thought about several things she could say, several professional and appropriate and safely bounded things. And then she thought about the sunflower seeds wrapped in cloth on the shelf, and the way he had said she can plant it with the specific weight of a man lowering a burden he had been holding too long alone, and she said, "Nothing. You don't owe me anything." Henry looked at her steadily. "That is not how I operate, Cora." She felt the warmth of her name in his voice move through her with the precision of a person who has been cold for a long time and suddenly feels the sun properly for the first time. She held his gaze. "Then plant those sunflowers well," she said. "And let that be enough for now." The morning they went to the county recorder's office in the town of Harlan was the morning that everything in the county shifted its position relative to Henry Malone, because towns in 1887 Texas were small and attentive, and the story of a female land consultant from Missouri who had identified survey fraud by a man as powerful as Fletcher Oaks in a document comparison done in a single afternoon was not a story that stayed quiet for long. The county recorder, a careful and meticulous man named Tom Abernathy, looked at Cora's comparison notes for 45 minutes with his reading glasses pushed up on his nose and his coffee going cold beside him, and at the end of those 45 minutes he looked up and said, "Miss Wells, this is the clearest identification of document fraud I have seen in my career." He looked at Henry. "You will want to speak with the district attorney." Henry spoke with the district attorney. Fletcher Oaks, presented with the evidence by the district attorney on a Wednesday morning, recanted his boundary claim within the hour and attributed the survey to an error by his surveyor, which everyone in Harlan County understood for what it was: the face-saving exit of a man who had been caught cleanly and knew it. There would be no prosecution, because that was not how things worked in 1887 in a county where Fletcher Oaks still owned the most land and the most influence. But there would also be no boundary claim, and there would be the very clear knowledge in every conversation in every saloon and general store in Harlan County that Fletcher Oaks had tried to take Henry Malone's land and had been stopped by a woman from Missouri who knew how to read a survey. Henry did not speak about this to Cora in terms of victory or vindication. He was not that kind of man. On the evening after the meeting with the district attorney, he came to find her in the east room where she was writing up her final notes, and he sat down across from her and said, "The boundary claim is resolved." "Good," Cora said. "Fletcher will not bother this ranch again," Henry said. "He knows that anything he tries will be examined now." "Yes," Cora said. Henry looked at her. She looked back at him. The candle on the desk between them was burning low, and it was throwing warm light across the papers and the books and the surface of the desk and the two faces on either side of it. "Cora," Henry said. She waited. "When does your contract with Holloway end?" She felt the question land in her chest. 2 weeks, she said carefully. Henry was quiet. "And then where do you go?" "I have an inquiry from a property in New Mexico Territory," she said, "and possibly a second engagement in the Hill Country if the work here generates the reference letter I need." Henry was very still. "If you leave before the harvest," he said, and then he stopped. Cora looked at him. "Yes." "If you leave before the harvest," he said again, and this time he finished it, "I will not know what I am looking at. You have put things in that field that I do not know how to read." Cora felt the corner of her mouth move. "You are asking me to stay until the harvest." "I am asking you," Henry said, "to stay." The plain simplicity of it, the directness of it, the fact that it was not qualified or hedged or dressed in professional language, sat between them in the candlelight with a clarity that was almost physical. "For the harvest," Cora said. "For as long as you are willing," Henry said, and he was looking at her with those steady, serious eyes, and there was nothing hidden in his expression, nothing armored or managed or held back. It was the face of a man who had decided to say a true thing to a woman he trusted. Cora set her pencil down. "I will write to New Mexico tomorrow," she said, "and decline the inquiry." Henry exhaled slowly, and it was one of the quietest and most complete sounds she had ever heard a person make. She did not sleep very well that night, but it was the good kind of sleeplessness, the kind that comes from having a very large feeling inhabiting the same body you are trying to rest in. In the weeks that followed, the West Field grew with the confidence of ground that had been waiting to be asked. The corn came up in straight rows, dark green and strong, reaching for the June sky with an urgency that Cora found professionally satisfying and personally delightful. The beans climbed their sticks and the squash sprawled magnificently, and the sweet peppers Ruth had ordered from Virginia took to the soil with what Cora could only describe, when she was writing in her journal in the evenings, as enthusiasm. And the sunflowers came up along the eastern edge on a Friday morning in the second week of June, small and certain and already orienting themselves toward the light. Henry saw them first. He was out early, before Cora was up, and when she came down and found him not in the kitchen, She looked out the east window and saw him standing at the fence line of the west field, looking at the sunflower seedlings in the morning light. She stood at the window for a moment and watched him, and she felt the complicated mix of emotions that she had been carrying for weeks resolve themselves very quietly into something simpler, something she had been resisting naming because she was a precise woman, and she did not like to name things she was not certain of. She was certain now. She went outside and crossed the yard and stood beside him at the fence, and they both looked at the seedlings in the morning light. After a while, Henry said, without looking at her, "She would have been out here at dawn." "I know," Cora said. "She would have talked to them," Henry said. "She used to talk to the plants she was growing inside. I told her they couldn't hear, and she told me I was underestimating them." Cora felt something between a laugh and something much more tender rise in her chest. "She may have been right about that too," she said. "There is some research suggesting that plants respond to vibration." Henry turned his head and looked at her with an expression of real amusement, the first completely unguarded moment of warmth she had seen on his face since she arrived. "Is there?" he said. "There is," Cora said. "It is not conclusive, but she would have been within reason to believe it." Henry looked back at the seedlings. He was smiling now, faintly, the same precursor of a smile she had catalogued before, but warmer this time. "Cora," he said, "I want you to know something." He paused, and she could feel him working toward it, the way a careful man works toward a true thing, making sure each step of the approach is solid before putting his weight on it. "Ruth was the great love of my life. She was the person I was supposed to be with, and I was with her, and she is gone. And that is a fact that does not change, and I am not asking you to stand beside me while I pretend it does not exist." Cora was very quiet. The morning light was on the sunflower seedlings. Somewhere in the cottonwood grove the first birds were beginning. "What are you asking?" she said. "I am asking," Henry said slowly, "whether it is possible that a man who loved one person with everything he had can also love another person, not less, not instead, but additionally, because of everything that happened and the person it made him." He looked at her. "I have been thinking about this for several weeks, and I cannot resolve it by myself." Cora turned to look at him fully. He was watching her with an openness that cost him something. She could see that clearly, the openness of a man who had been closed for 3 years and was choosing not to be. "I think," she said carefully, "that the capacity to love does not operate on a fixed supply. I think Ruth would have understood that because she was clearly a person of considerable intelligence and generosity of spirit." She paused. "I also think that whatever you are asking is something you should be certain of before you ask it more directly." Henry's mouth curved. It was a real smile this time. "I am certain," he said. Cora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Then I suggest you ask it more directly." Henry turned to face her fully. He was standing very close in the morning air, with the growing field behind him and the sky going gold above the ridge. "Cora Wells," he said, "I am asking you to stay, not for the harvest, not for the next engagement, here with me." The world was very quiet and very bright, and the sunflower seedlings were orienting themselves toward the sun along the eastern edge of the west field, doing the finest thing a living thing could do. Cora said, "Yes." The summer that followed was the most alive summer Henry Malone had experienced in 3 years, and the most alive summer Cora Wells had experienced in her entire adult life, which she acknowledged to herself with the precise honesty that was her characteristic mode. She wrote to Gerard Holloway and informed him that she was extending her stay at the Malone Ranch on a personal basis, and that he should direct further professional inquiries to her in care of the ranch address. She wrote to the agronomist she knew in Missouri and described the Westfield conditions in delighted detail. She wrote to her father's old colleague at the Missouri Extension Office and told him that she had found a piece of ground worth staying for, which she understood was about more than the ground, and she thought her father would have approved. Henry, for his part, was learning what it was to have someone in his life who matched him, not just companionably but completely, who could hold the complexity of the ranch operations in her mind, alongside the complexity of the people who worked there, who knew the West Field as well as he did now, and who had opinions about the cattle pasture rotation, and the repair schedule for the south fence and the water table under the cottonwood grove, and who said what she thought with the directness that had, he realized, been the thing he was drawn to in her from the very beginning. He had known a great many people in his life who softened everything they said to protect themselves or to manage the feelings of the person they were talking to. Cora Wells did not do that. She was not unkind, but she was clear, and the clarity of her, the precision of her mind and her assessments and her attention, was something he had not known he was missing until it was present. He asked her to marry him in the West Field on a Sunday in late July, which was the only place that felt right for it, with the corn at head height around them, and the sunflowers already 4 feet tall along the eastern edge, and the smell of warm earth and green growing things in the air. He did not make a speech about it. He was not a man who made speeches. He said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life arguing with you about agricultural methodology, and I need it to be legal." And Cora laughed, genuinely laughed, the unguarded laugh of a woman who was not performing happiness but experiencing it. And she said yes the same way she had said yes at the fence line, simply and completely and without reservation. They were married in September before the harvest in the small church in town. Cal Briggs stood up for Henry. A woman named Margaret Holloway, the lawyer's wife who had taken a decided interest in Cora's professional situation and become something like a friend in the preceding months, stood up for Cora. The ceremony was short and direct, because both parties preferred directness, and afterward there was a gathering at the ranch that included what appeared to be a significant portion of Harlan County, all of whom had developed opinions about Cora Wells over the course of the summer and all of whom seemed, even the ones who had originally been skeptical, to have arrived at positive ones. Fletcher Oaks did not attend, which surprised no one. The harvest that fall was everything Cora's projections had promised, and in some respects more, because the sunflowers along the eastern edge had grown to precisely 8 feet tall, exactly as Ruth had dreamed them, and they stood in the late September light like a proclamation, gold and enormous, and facing the morning with the perfect loyalty of things that know what they are for. Henry stood at the fence and looked at them on the morning of the harvest. Cora came to stand beside him. "She was right about the 8 feet, Henry said. "She was," Cora agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was not a small gesture for a man of his particular reserve, and she leaned against him, which was not a small gesture for a woman of her particular independence, and they stood together looking at the sunflowers in Ruth's field that was also their field now. "Thank you," Henry said quietly. Cora looked up at him. "For what specifically?" "For asking," he said. "For not accepting no." She considered this. "I accepted no the first time," she pointed out. "I waited 4 days." He looked down at her with the warm, specific smile that she had been collecting all summer like field notes. "You planned a strategy," he said. "I planned a strategy," she agreed. He kissed her, there in the west field in the September light, with the sunflowers reaching their faces toward the morning exactly as Ruth had known they would. And it was not a gentle sort of kiss, but the kind that had 3 years of solitude on one side and a whole future on the other. And Cora put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and certain under her palm, and thought that the West Field had done exactly what good ground always did when you gave it the right conditions. It had grown something extraordinary. The harvest required 4 days, and by the end of it the yield numbers in Cora's journal were better than the high end of her projections, because the summer had been favorable, and the soil preparation had been thorough, and the companion planting had performed precisely as the agricultural science suggested it should. The corn yield alone was sufficient to cover the annual operating costs of the ranch with a modest surplus. The vegetable yield would more than meet the equipment loan payment. The watermelons, which Henry had once told Ruth would not grow in that soil, produced 42 specimens of impressive size, each one a quiet and final proof of Ruth's argument. Henry looked at the watermelons in their pile beside the barn and shook his head, and Cora could not tell from his expression whether he was amused or grieving or both, but she thought that in this case the two things were not incompatible. "She wins," he said. "She always did," Cora said, and Henry nodded, and there was a peace in it that was not forgetting but a different kind of keeping. The winter that settled over the Malone ranch in 1887 was the first winter Henry had not spent in a sort of gray isolation since Ruth died. The house was different with Cora in it, not louder exactly, because she was not loud by nature, but more inhabited, more intentionally lived in. She used the desk in the East Room as her study, and her books multiplied on the shelf beside her father's field journals, and she had opinions about how the kitchen garden should be reorganized in the spring, and she was teaching herself to ride a horse with the specific focused efficiency she brought to all new skills, and she was present in a way that filled in the silences of the house without eliminating them, because some silences were valuable, and she understood that. Henry found himself talking more than he had in years. Not about large things, necessarily, but about the small and continuous things of ranch life, the condition of the pasture, and the plans for the spring, and the particular obstinance of the bay gelding who lived in the third stall, and had never respected any fence he did not feel like respecting. He found that Cora's responses to these things, the precise, direct, occasionally surprising responses of a woman whose mind operated on two levels at once, were things he looked forward to in the way you look forward to food when you have been genuinely hungry. He also found that grief did not have a set amount of room in a life. It did not need to be displaced by happiness. It could coexist. He thought about Ruth often, not with the raw specific pain of the first years, but with the more settled feeling of a man who loved someone who was gone and had made peace with the shape of that love over time. He thought that Ruth, who had been a woman of considerable intelligence and generosity, would not have wanted the grief to be the whole story. He thought she would have wanted the sunflowers. He thought, sometimes, that she would have liked Cora. And he thought that Cora, who had already demonstrated a clear and genuine regard for the quality of Ruth's mind, would have liked her in return. The thought did not hurt. It felt, unexpectedly, like a small wholeness. In the spring of 1888, Cora turned her attention to the formal expansion of the West Field planting plan, incorporating 2 additional acres that she identified as suitable for a market garden operation. And she began the correspondence with the nearest town's general store about a supply arrangement for fresh vegetables, which would provide a consistent revenue stream. She also began working more quietly on the professional problem that had been the background condition of her entire working life, the fact that her work was her own, but her recognition was always qualified or partial or conditional. She wrote to the Missouri Extension Office under her own name. She wrote to a botanical journal in St. Louis about the companion planting results from the West Field, submitting it as a field study, because the results were genuinely worth the scientific community's attention. She wrote to Gerard Holloway with a formal proposal for a consulting arrangement on her own terms. No more working under the veil of C.E. Wells, consultant, but Cora Wells Malone, agricultural consultant, with a record of documented results in soil reclamation and crop optimization, that she was prepared to defend against any professional scrutiny. Holloway wrote back after 2 weeks with an acceptance that she understood had cost him some professional adjustment and appreciated for the cost of it. Henry read the letter and said, "Now they know who you are." "They always knew," Cora said. "They just did not want to say it." "They know now," he said again, and the quiet firmness of it was his version of fighting on her behalf, the recognition of a man who understood what she had been carrying and was saying. Now it is laid down, and she received it exactly as it was meant. The Botanical Journal published her companion planting study in the fall of 1888. It was the first piece of agricultural research published under a woman's name in that journal in its 14-year history. Cora received 3 letters of professional inquiry in the following month from agricultural operations across the region. She answered each one on Malone Ranch letterhead. In the winter of 1888, she told Henry she was expecting a child. He received this news in the kitchen at breakfast, and she watched him carefully because she wanted to see the whole of his response and not just the surface of it. He was very still for a moment, and she could see him taking the information in through all the layers of himself, the surface and the deep, and what she saw in his face was not uncomplicated, because Henry Malone's feelings were never simple things, but at the center of the complexity was something clear and certain and good. He reached across the table and took her hand, which he held quietly for a moment. "Are you well?" He said, which she found very characteristic of him, that his first response was practical concern for her rather than an expression of his own feeling. "Entirely," she said. "Good," he said. He looked at her hand in his for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to plant something in the spring, for the child." Cora smiled. "What were you thinking?" "An apple tree," Henry said, "along the south fence. Ruth always wanted an orchard, but we never got to it." Cora thought about this. "Apple trees in this climate will need careful variety selection," she said. "I know of a drought-resistant variety that does well in hill country conditions." "Of course you do," Henry said, and he was smiling with the full warmth of it, not the precursor of a smile but the real thing. "I will write to the nursery in San Antonio," Cora said. Henry lifted her hand and held it briefly to his lips, which was the most romantically formal gesture she had seen from him, and which flustered her considerably, because she was a woman of precise self-possession, and he had found, over the course of their marriage, several specific and reliable ways to get past it. Their son was born in the late summer of 1889, in the house on the ranch, delivered by the doctor from town in Dora, who proved to be an entirely competent assistant and considerably calmer than Henry, who was not calm in the way that surprised Cora because he was calm about nearly everything else. The boy was healthy and strong, and arrived at 4 in the morning with the particular decisive timing of someone who had somewhere to be. Henry held him in the kitchen in the early light and looked at him with an expression that Cora, watching from the bed with the specific exhaustion of a woman who has just done the hardest work of her life, would carry in her memory for the rest of her years. It was the expression of a man encountering a thing that was larger than he had prepared for. "What do we name him?" Henry asked. "I was thinking James," Cora said, "for my father." Henry looked at her. "James Malone," he said, "unless you have objections." "None," Henry said. He looked down at the boy again. "James." Cora watched the two of them, her husband and her son, in the early light of a Texas summer morning, and she thought about all the things that had been required to arrive at this particular kitchen in this particular moment. A woman who died in a field, and a man who could not go back to it, and a soil probe and a set of labeled seed tins, and the particular courage of saying yes when you had been saying no for 3 years. And the fact that the ground, when you finally let it, had grown something that neither one of them had been entirely prepared for. The apple trees went in along the south fence that spring, 6 trees of the drought-resistant variety, and by the time James Malone was old enough to run between them, they were already beginning to show the small, knotted promise of their first fruit. The West Field continued to produce each season with the dependability of well-understood ground, and Cora continued to refine the rotation plan, and the ranch moved from its precarious financial position to a stable one, and then to something that could reasonably be called prosperous, which in Harlan County, Texas in the late 1880s meant cattle that were healthy and ground that was producing and debts that were paid and a family that ate well. Cal Briggs eventually said to Henry at the end of a long day in the fall of 1890, "She saved this place, you know," and Henry said, "I know," and Cal said, "I mean the field specifically," Everything started there, and Henry was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She asked to plant it, and I said yes. Everything started there." Cal nodded and went about his business, and Henry stood at the gate of the west field in the October light. The sunflowers long since harvested, and the ground turned for its winter rest. And he thought about the morning 3 years before when a woman with a soil probe had walked into this field as if she had every right to it, and had been, in the specific and irreversible way of things that are simply true, exactly right. He thought about Ruth, whose seeds had grown here 3 years after she had packed them in cloth and set them on a shelf, as if she had known all along that the right hands would find them eventually. He thought about Cora, who was inside right now putting James to bed and arguing, probably, with the almanac about the projected first frost date in the hill country. He thought about the particular shape his life had taken, which was not the shape he had drawn for himself, and was better than anything he had drawn for himself in ways that he did not have the precise vocabulary to articulate, but felt in his bones every morning. He woke up and found the ranch in order and his wife beside him, and the ground full of everything they had planted together. There was a sound behind him, boots on the dry grass, and Cora came to stand beside him at the fence. "He is asleep," she said, "already." He was tired. He spent most of the afternoon trying to convince the bay gelding to respect the east fence. She paused. He did not succeed, but his persistence was impressive. Henry smiled. "He gets that from you, the persistence, the certainty that the right approach will eventually work." Cora looked at him with the clear gray eyes that had been measuring things since the first morning she walked into this field. "Has it," she said, "worked?" Henry looked at the field and at the ranch and at his wife. "Beyond all my projections," he said. Cora laughed, the real laugh, the one that she only gave fully when she was genuinely delighted, and Henry put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence of the west field in the last light of an October evening, and the ground was quiet under them, doing what good ground always does between the seasons, holding everything that had been put into it and preparing, in its patient, certain way, for the spring. In the years that followed, the west field became the center around which the rest of the ranch organized itself, not just economically, but in the way that certain places become centers because of what happened in them and what grew in them and what was given back to them. James grew up knowing the field the way you know a place that is both ordinary and sacred, the place where the sunflowers were, the place where his parents went to talk in the evenings, the place where his mother drove soil probes and his father drove furrows, and the two of them argued about plant spacing with the focused energy of people who cared deeply about both the argument and each other. In 1892, James acquired a brother, a boy they named Thomas for Henry's father, who arrived in early spring with the same decisive timing as his brother and considerably more volume, which Dora said was a good sign, and the doctor confirmed was entirely healthy. Thomas took after Henry in his quietness and after Cora in his stubbornness, and was, by the age of 2, already conducting what appeared to be assessments of the soil quality in every patch of ground he could reach, which Cora found professionally amusing and personally very touching. The apple trees along the south fence bore their first full fruit in the fall of 1893. And Cora made preserves from them that she labeled in her careful hand, and set on the kitchen shelf in the space that had once held Ruth's seed tins, the tins that had long since been emptied and cleaned and repurposed, and were now used for the good preserves, and the saved seeds of Cora's own best varieties, carrying forward the practice of a woman she had never met but had come to know, field by field. In the ground they shared. Henry found her there one evening, in the kitchen with the preserve jars, and he looked at the shelf and at the tins and at her, and he said nothing because nothing was required, only put his hand on her back in the quiet way he had, and she leaned slightly into the warmth of him, and outside the window the ranch lay in the evening light, the west field and the south fence apple trees and the cattle in the far pasture, and the long clear Texas sky going orange above the ridge. And it was exactly what it had grown into, A life fully planted, well-tended, growing.